When you imagine the life of a Roman midwife, do not imagine excitement. Imagine instead a slow, heavy dawn where the city is still half asleep, and the day begins in silence. The midwife would rise before the sun itself. She did not wake to an alarm or to the rush of urgency, but to the quiet rhythm of Roman streets stirring one by one. A cart creaking in the distance, the faint sound of water being poured into clay jars. The scratch of a broom sweeping the stone steps outside. These were the sounds that woke her slowly, gently. Her room would have been plain, its walls painted with fading plaster, perhaps a faded red or dull cream. A low bed, a thin linen sheet, and the faint coolness of the night air still lingering. Before the sun began to warm the rooftops, she would sit upright, slowly, her body stiff from the day before. The first task was always preparation. Her hands, calloused but steady, moved across the small collection of tools she kept close. Bronze scissors, not sharp by modern standards, but serviceable. A few worn claws, carefully folded from the last washing. A leather pouch filled with herbs and dried roots, each with its own smell, its own purpose. She would take them out, one by one, inspecting them in the dim light. The bitter scent of rue, the sharp tang of garlic, the soothing sweetness of honey. She knew them all by touch, by smell, by memory. Water would be poured into a basin, and she would wash her hands with slow, practiced motions. The water was not warm, not perfumed, just cool, drawn from the nearest fountain earlier that morning. She would dry them on rough linen, knowing she would do the same again and again, for every house she visited, every birth she attended. Outside, the city was beginning to stir. The clatter of hooves on stone streets, the muffled call of a baker advertising his bread, the faint metallic sound of a blacksmith's hammer echoing far away. But for the midwife, the world stayed quiet, measured, calm. Her day would not begin in haste. It began in waiting. She tied her satchel closed, the leather straps creaking softly. She adjusted her tunic, simple and practical, tied at the waist with a cord. No jewels, no ornaments, no sign of luxury. A midwife did not need decoration. She needed steadiness. She needed hands that did not tremble, eyes that did not waver. The streets outside smelled faintly of smoke from the night's fires, of damp stone cooling in the morning air. She stepped carefully, sandals slapping softly against the ground. The city did not notice her. Men hurried to markets. Children played in the courtyards. But the midwife moved in silence, passing through the crowd like a shadow every morning, was the same. The same walk, the same tools, the same quiet air of expectation. Somewhere in the city, a woman would be waiting. Somewhere, a family would be anxious. Somewhere, the long, slow work of birth was beginning, or had already begun. And the midwife, calm, steady, deliberate, would be called to it. But before that moment, there was stillness. A deep, quiet stillness. The kind of stillness where the world feels suspended, just for a breath, just for a pause. A stillness that carried her through the streets, her satchel at her side, her steps slow and even, toward another day in the life of a Roman midwife. A Roman midwife could never begin her day without first checking her chest of remedies. It was not a chest in the sense of a heavy trunk locked with iron, but more often a wooden box, sometimes no larger than a man's arm, with compartments and jars carefully tucked inside. For her, this chest was as important as her own hands. It was the storehouse of every cure, every ritual, every hope she carried from one household to another. The work began slowly, almost ritualistically, long before she reached the door of any expectant mother. The chest would be placed on a low table or stool, its lid pushed back to reveal the collection of small clay jars, folded cloth packets, and leather pouches that rattled softly when lifted. Each one carried the faint memory of past births, herbs that had been crushed and burned, roots that had been boiled into bitter tea, oils rubbed into weary skin. The midwife had learned to organize these by habit so that her hand could find fennel seeds in the dark, or pull out a strip of cloth dipped in honey without fumbling dots. She began with the herbs. Fennel was always there, its seeds small and ridged. carrying a faint, sweet scent. They were chewed to ease the stomach, boiled to make teas, and sometimes even sprinkled in wine. To Midwife, fennel was a comfort herb, not powerful, not miraculous, but steady, dependable, and always useful. Next was rue, the opposite of comfort. Its sharp, bitter smell lingered even when the pouch was tied shut, a smell that made one wrinkle the nose. Rue was used sparingly, for it was strong, sometimes dangerous. Yet women believed it carried protective powers, that it could ward off evil spirits or coax stubborn bodies to move in the right rhythm. The midwife did not argue with such beliefs. She kept it ready, folded tightly in its cloth. There was garlic, too, not just for food, but for health. Crushed into paste, rubbed on the skin, or boiled into water, garlic was a universal cure in the Roman imagination. Some believed it could drive out illness. Others placed cloves near the birthing bed to keep away misfortune. Its pungent odor clung to her hands long after she had handled it, a reminder that medicine did not always come with pleasant scents. Honey, thick and golden, was another staple. Stored in a small clay pot with a wax seal, it served as both food and medicine. Honey soothed wounds, covered infections, and eased throats. The midwife prized it because it was gentle and healing, and because nearly every Roman family trusted it. When mothers hesitated to swallow bitter teas or strong-tasting mixtures, honey made them bearable. It softened the sharpness of rue, the bitterness of herbs, the edge of fear. Beside these, there were jars of oil, olive oil, pressed thick and fragrant. Oil was essential for massage, for soothing tense muscles, and for easing the body into the long, slow process of birth. She would dip her fingers into the jar, rub the oil into her palms, and warm it before applying it. The smell was earthy, heavy, lingering in the air long after she left. Some items were not purely medicinal. Amulets wrapped in cord, small charms. In the shape of hands or eyes, tiny figurines of gods or goddesses, these were kept as much for the women she treated as for herself. In childbirth, faith was as strong as medicine. Families expected the midwife to know when to place a charm. Under a pillow, when to whisper a prayer to Lucina, the goddess of childbirth, or when to tie a protective thread around the mother's wrist. The midwife's chest therefore held not only herbs and oils, but these little tokens of belief carried quietly from house to house, once the chest was open and the jars inspected. The midwife would begin the careful, unhurried work of preparation. Seeds were measured out into small packets, tied with strips of linen. Dried roots were ground slowly with a mortar and pestle, the dull thud of stone echoing in the room. She would mix them into powders, sometimes combining them with honey or oil, sometimes leaving them separate until needed. The air filled with a mixture of scents, bitter, sweet, sharp, soothing. It was not pleasant, not unpleasant, but complex, layered, a smell she carried with her wherever she went. This work was not hurried. The midwife did not rush through it, for every motion had its place. She ground slowly, folded carefully, and tied neatly. Each jar was inspected for cracks, each pouch checked for dampness. A spoiled herb was worse than no herb at all, and so she worked with patience. She did not think of the time, for the hours would pass whether she worked quickly or slowly. It was better to be slow, better to be sure. After the herbs came the cloths. Linen was precious, not wasted. Each piece was washed in cold water, dried in the air, and folded tightly. Some were cut into strips for bandages, others left whole for swaddling. The midwife inspected them in the light, holding them to see if any stains or weak spots remained. A torn cloth could fail at a crucial moment, and so she discarded any that seemed too worn, too thin. She stacked the good ones neatly, pressing them flat so that they would take up less space in the chest. Herbal mixtures, oils, cloths, charms, all were returned to their compartments. The chest closed with a soft thud, its weight a reminder of her responsibility. When she lifted it, the straps creaked under the strain, and her arms remembered the weight from hundreds of mornings like this one. It was not heavy enough to burden her, but heavy enough to remind her of the life she carried with her. Remedies, rituals, protections, all resting in a wooden box. And then, with the chest prepared, she would sit quietly for a moment. This pause was not wasted time. It was part of the rhythm. She would sit, her hands resting on her lap, listening to the faint sounds of the street outside. The call of a vendor selling figs, the creak of a cartwheel turning, the splash of water poured into amphory. She would take a slow breath, her mind turning to the women who would need her today. Some she knew well, women she had helped through many births. Others were strangers, their names given to her only that morning. Each call was different, and yet, in the end, each was the same. A woman waiting, a family watching, a child arriving into the world. And so the midwife, with her chest of herbs and her quiet patience, prepared herself for another day. The work was never glamorous, never celebrated, but it was steady, necessary, and unending. She rose, she prepared, and she carried her remedies into the city, one slow step at a time. The midwife's day truly began not in her own home, but in the streets of the city. She did not wait long before a knock would sound at her door, or a neighbor would whisper through the opening in the wall, or sometimes a boy would run up carrying the words of a family in need. Rarely did she have to search for work. Instead, the work found her, as it always did, as it always would. Childbirth was not something that paused for convenience, and Rome itself was never free of it. In Insulae, the crowded apartment blocks, in the sprawling villas of the wealthy, even in the cramped rooms behind bakeries or bathhouses, somewhere a woman was in labor, and somewhere a family grew anxious. When the call came, the midwife gathered her chest, slung its strap across her shoulder, and stepped outside. The Roman streets in the morning were already alive, though not in the hurried way we imagine. They awoke slowly, in waves, each sound blending into the next. First came the water carriers, filling their amphory from the fountains, the splash, and gurgle of water echoing against stone. Then the bakers pulling bread from their ovens, the smell of warm dough drifting through the air. Merchants unrolled their stalls, shaking out cloths, stacking pottery, arranging baskets of figs and olives. Donkeys brayed as their masters loaded them with bundles of firewood or sacks of grain. And among all this noise and movement, the midwife walked steadily, not rushing, not lingering, but moving with the slow rhythm of the city. Her sandals struck the stone pavement softly, a sound easily lost beneath the clatter of hooves and the chatter of voices. Yet she noticed everything. She noticed how the paving stones, worn smooth by centuries of feet, were damp with morning dew. She noticed how children, barefoot and still half asleep, played near the fountains, splashing each other before their mothers called them away. She noticed the faint smell of smoke still drifting from the night's fires, mixed now with the sharper tang of fish being laid out at the market. All of these things blended into the morning air, not distinct, not separate, but woven together. Into the endless hum of Roman life. As she walked, she carried more than her chest. She carried her reputation. People knew her face, though not all greeted her. Some nodded respectfully, for they trusted her skills, perhaps remembering how she had once brought their own child into the world. Others averted their gaze, for childbirth carried shadows as well as light, and not all stories ended happily. Still, she was a familiar presence, moving from one district to another, always summoned, always expected, always carrying with her the silent weight of birth and its uncertainties. The path to her destination was rarely straight. Roman streets, twisted and turned, opening into wide forums, narrowing again into alleys. She might pass under a triumphal arch where soldiers once marched, only to find herself moments later pressed between the high, crumbling walls of Insulae where laundry dripped from ropes above. She moved through both worlds with equal ease. The grandeur of marble and the squalor of brick, for birth did not distinguish between rich and poor. The wealthy could afford cleaner rooms, more attendants, finer oils, but in the end, the cries of labor and the slow work of bringing a child into the world sounded the same dot. Sometimes the call took her to a villa. Its gates heavy with iron, its courtyard echoing with the splash of a fountain. Servants would hurry to open doors, guiding her across mosaics and polished floors, leading her into rooms where women of status reclined on couches, pale with worry. Other times, the call brought her to a cramped apartment in an insula, 4 or 5 stories high, where wooden stairs creaked beneath her feet and the air smelled of smoke, sweat, and boiled cabbage. In such places, she often had to stoop through narrow doorways, her chest bumping against the frame as she entered. Inside, a mother would be waiting on a straw mattress, attended by sisters or neighbors who whispered anxiously, hoping that the midwife's presence alone might bring calm. The streets between these homes were her domain, the space where she moved from one world to another, and in those walks, she often had time to think. She thought about the births she had seen before, about the women she had helped, about the children who had lived and those who had not. She thought, too, about her tools, whether the herbs she carried would be enough, whether the gods would favor her work today, whether her hands would remain steady. These thoughts came not as worries, but as part of the rhythm. As natural as the sound of her own footsteps, the city itself seemed to recognize her role, even if it did not celebrate it. When she passed through a market, some vendors would quietly step aside, letting her through, understanding that her work was not to be delayed. When she crossed near a temple, she sometimes paused not to pray, but to glance at the statues, acknowledging silently that her work was tied to theirs, that the goddess Lucina and others watched over the same labor she attended. When she passed children playing in the streets, she often felt a fleeting thought that perhaps she had once held one of them as a newborn, wrapped in swaddling cloth, their first cries still echoing faintly in her memory dot. And so the walk was never just a walk. It was part of the labor, part of the work itself. The city stretched around her, alive, bustling, noisy, but her pace remained slow, measured, deliberate. She could not afford to arrive flustered, out of breath, or distracted. She had to arrive calm, collected, ready to bring steadiness into a room where panic often lingered. The walk through the streets gave her that calm, gave her time to settle, her mind to let the noise of the city wash over her without clinging. By the time she reached her destination, she was not just a woman with herbs and tools. She was a presence, quiet and steady, prepared to guide another family through the long, uncertain hours ahead. The first call of the day was never the same, and yet it always felt familiar. Whether she arrived at a grand villa or a smoky insula, the sound was always the same. A door opening, hurried footsteps, anxious voices calling her name. And then, with the chest heavy at her side and the smell of herbs clinging to her hands, she would cross the threshold, leaving the noise of the streets behind, and enter the quieter, more urgent world of the birthing room. The birthing room of ancient Rome was not a public space, nor a place of men. It was a world set apart, closed behind doors, where women gathered together and the midwife held authority. When the midwife arrived, her steps slowed, and her presence shifted. Outside, the city might be filled with clamor, carts creaking, merchants shouting, sandals scuffing against stone, but inside, the air was thick, heavy, expectant. It was a room where time seemed to move differently, where hours stretched, long and minutes passed unnoticed. The room itself was rarely grand. Even in the villas of the wealthy, it was kept dim, quiet, shielded from noise. Curtains were pulled across doorways, windows covered to keep drafts away. Oil lamps flickered faintly, their smoke curling upward to leave black stains on the ceiling. In smaller homes, the birthing space might be no more than a corner, cleared near a bed, the light of one lamp casting long wavering shadows against bare plaster walls. No matter the wealth of the family, the room shared the same atmosphere. Warmth, closeness, the smell of oil and sweat and herbs blending together until they seemed like one. The women inside filled the space with whispers and movement. Sisters, mothers, and neighbors sat close by, their voices hushed but steady, as if constant talking could hold fear at bay. Some wove cloth or rubbed oils into their palms, more for distraction than for need. Others simply held the laboring. Woman's hand murmuring encouragements, repeating the same words again and again in rhythm with her breathing. There was comfort in this repetition, in the cycle of words that did not need to change. The birthing room was not a place for silence, nor for loudness. It was a place for murmurs, for the gentle hum of women sharing the weight of the moment. When the midwife entered, the room shifted. No trumpets sounded, no announcements were made, but every face turned toward her. For a moment, the whispering paused. She was not a figure of power in the way a senator or magistrate was, but within those walls, she carried an authority no man could rival. She was the one who knew the rhythms of labor, who could judge the slow unfolding of the body, who could decide when to wait and when to act. She did not need to speak loudly. Her presence alone gave shape to the room. The other women adjusted their places, gave her space, and allowed her to begin. The laboring woman herself was often stretched across a low bed or supported on a birthing stool, her body shifting restlessly with the waves of pain. Her hair might be loose, her clothes loosened, her skin damp with sweat. Her eyes followed the midwife, sometimes filled with fear, sometimes with relief, sometimes with nothing but exhaustion. The midwife moved to her side quietly, without hurry, her chest of remedies set carefully near the bed. She placed her hand on the woman's arm or forehead, not roughly, not clinically, but with a steady touch that carried reassurance. This simple act, the touch of the midwife's hand, often mattered as much as any herb or oil she carried. The tools of the midwife were simple, and she brought them out slowly, one by one, not to alarm, but to prepare. A cloth dipkin, cool water laid across the brow, a small jar of oil, warmed between her hands, rubbed gently across the lower back or the belly to ease tension. A charm tied around the wrist, whispered over with a prayer to Lucina, the goddess of childbirth. These were not miracles, not cures, but gestures, acts of steadiness, each one reminding the mother that she was not alone. The midwife's role was not only to guide the body, but also to guide the mind, to make fear quieter, to make time feel less heavy. The birthing room was filled with smells that clung to every surface. The sharp, bitter scent of herbs crushed in a mortar, the faint sweetness of honey, the earthy heaviness of olive oil, and always the underlying smell of sweat and blood. To outsiders, these scents might have seemed unpleasant, but to the midwife, they were familiar, part of the rhythm of her life. They were the smells of work, of effort, of beginnings. She breathed them in without flinching, as natural to her as the smoke of the lamps or the sound of murmured voices. The sounds, too, were layered. The low groans of the laboring woman, drawn out and uneven. The whispers of encouragement from women nearby, repeating phrases in a slow chant. The steady voice of the midwife, calm and clear, giving instructions not in shouts, but in words chosen carefully, measured to be heard without urgency. And beneath it all, the quiet hum of the city outside, muffled, distant, like a reminder that the world continued on, unaware of the struggle contained within this small room. There was a rhythm to the hours spent here. Contractions came and went, rising and falling like waves, and with them the attention of every woman in the room shifted. In the quiet moments between, there was waiting long stretches of stillness where nothing seemed to happen, where time hung heavy in the air. In these moments, the midwife checked her tools, whispered with the attendants, or simply sat near the mother, her presence alone a comfort. She did not fill the silence with unnecessary words. She understood that labor was not a thing to be rushed. It was slow, and so she too slowed dot in some bursts. Everything unfolded steadily. The hours passed, the child came, the room filled with relief. In others, the hours stretched long. The mother's strength waned and the midwife's role grew heavier. She had to decide whether to use stronger herbs, whether to call upon prayers more urgently, whether to attempt techniques she knew carried risk. These choices weighed silently on her, but she did not show hesitation. To the women watching, she was steady. To the mother, she was calm. Inside, She may have felt the weight of uncertainty, but outwardly she was composed. The birthing room was thus not only a physical place, but a world of its own. It was a place where time lost its meaning, where women gathered in roles passed down for generations, where the midwife's presence shaped the outcome in ways both practical and unseen. It was separate from the streets outside, from the markets, and forums, from the noise of Roman life. Behind its doors, only one thing mattered: the slow, difficult, uncertain journey of bringing a new life into the world. And in that world, the midwife moved with quiet authority, carrying her chest, her herbs, her voice, and above all, her calm presence, a steady flame in the dim light of the birthing room. Labor in ancient Rome was not measured by clocks. There were no ticking hands, no neat divisions of minutes and hours. Time inside the birthing room was fluid, stretching and contracting much like the pains themselves. A single hour could feel like an eternity, while an entire day could pass unnoticed. For the midwife, this strange rhythm was familiar. She had lived it many times before, and she knew that her role was not only to act, but also to endure, to remain steady during the long stretches of waiting that defined childbirth. More than any single moment, the hours of labor began quietly. At first, the contractions were far apart, like distant waves breaking gently against a shore. The mother breathed through them, her body tensing and relaxing, her hands clenching and unclenching. The women around her encouraged her softly, their voices low and rhythmic, as though they could smooth the sharpness of pain with their words. The midwife did not rush to intervene. She watched carefully, noting the way the mother's body shifted, listening to the tone of her groans, observing how her strength rose and fell. Observation was her first tool, the act of simply watching, attentively, without impatience. As the hours passed, the rhythm changed. The pains grew closer, sharper, their grip more insistent. The room shifted with them. Conversations that had once been soft and steady now broke into shorter phrases, each time between contractions. The mother's breathing grew heavier, body slick with sweat, strands of hair sticking to her face. The midwife moved closer, her hands ready, her voice calm. She did not raise her tone above the others. Instead, she spoke clearly, slowly, each word measured like a stone placed carefully in a path. Breathe here. Hold here. Rest now. These words were repeated often, not because the mother forgot, but because repetition itself was a kind of anchor. There were long stretches where nothing seemed to happen, at least to those watching. The contractions ebbed, the mother's body slackened in exhaustion, and the room settled into a heavy silence broken only by the hiss of the oil lamp or the shuffle of a cloth being wrung out in water. In those moments, the midwife did not allow her own energy to falter. She sat close, sometimes resting a hand on the mother's shoulder, sometimes checking her tools again, sometimes simply waiting. Waiting was its own kind of work, a discipline of patience, for she knew that rushing could not change the body's slow unfolding. The attendants often grew restless during these hours. Younger women fidgeted, whispered among themselves, or asked questions in low tones. Is it going well? How long will it take? Will she be all right? The midwife rarely answered directly. Instead, she offered nods, brief reassurances, and gestures of calm. To give answers was dangerous, for she could not promise outcomes, and she would not lie. What she offered instead was presence, the quiet steadiness of someone who had seen this before, who knew the long road of labor, and who did not fear its length. Sometimes she used her knowledge of herbs to ease the hours. A cloth dipped in warm water, infused with chamomile or fennel, pressed gently against the belly to relax tense muscles. A sip of wine mixed with honey, given slowly between contractions to steady nerves and restore a little strength. A charm tied loosely around the wrist or ankle, more for comfort than for power, whispered over with prayers to Juno Lucina, the goddess who watched over births. These small acts did not erase the pain, but they gave shape to the waiting, filling. It was gestures of care. The mother's cries grew sharper as the hours stretched on. Pain was not quiet, nor was it hidden. It filled the room, rising and falling, mingling with the voices of those who encouraged her. The midwife did not flinch from these sounds. To her, they were not frightening, but familiar, a necessary part of the process. She listened carefully, hearing not only the volume of the cries, but their tone, their rhythm, their changes. She could tell when the mother's strength was faltering, when fear was overtaking her, when exhaustion was heavy in. Her voice. Each shift told her something about what was happening, about what was still to come in moments of exhaustion. When the mother whispered that she could not go on, the midwife leaned close. She did not offer false promises, but she offered steadiness. You can. Your body is stronger than you think. These words were spoken softly, repeated again and again, not dramatic, not shouted, but steady. They were the kind of words that did not pierce through the pain, but wrapped around it like a cloak against the cold. The hours of labor blurred together, marked only by the shifting weight of the mother's breathing and the steady patience of the midwife. To an outsider, they might have seemed monotonous, endless, a slow cycle of pain, waiting, whispers, and silence. But to the midwife, it was a familiar rhythm, one she had lived through countless times. Each birth carried its own uncertainties, its own dangers, yet the pattern remained. Pain, patience, waiting, guiding. Over and over again, hour after hour, until at last the moment of change arrived. Through it all, the midwife remained the axis, around which the room turned. The attendants looked to her. The mother leaned on her. Even the silence seemed to take its shape from her calm. She did not rush. She did not falter. She did not allow the length of the hours to unsteady her. For she knew that the heart of her work was not only in the moments of action, but in the long stretches of waiting, watching, guiding, the slow, heavy hours of labor that tested not just the mother's endurance, but her own. And so the hours, tasked, unmeasured, unmarked, stretching long into the day or into the night. The lamps burned low, the air grew thick, and still the midwife waited, steady as stone, her presence as constant as the rhythm of breath and pain. For in the end, her role was not only to deliver the child, but to carry everyone in the room through the long, uncertain journey that came before it, the hours of labor that seemed endless, until suddenly they were not. After endless hours of labor, when time seemed to blur into one long stretch of pain and waiting, there would come a shift. It was not always dramatic, not always sudden, but the midwife felt it. She sensed it in the rhythm of the contractions, in the way the mother's body changed, in the tone of her cries. It was as though the long wandering road of labor, twisting and uncertain, finally curved toward its destination. This was the turning point, the moment when all the waiting gave way to action, when the room grew taut with anticipation, and every eye turned once again to the midwife. The air in the birthing room thickened. Attendants who had grown weary during the long hours sat straighter. Whispers fell into silence, broken only by the mother's heavy breathing and the quiet instructions of the midwife. She moved with calm precision, preparing what was needed. The stool was adjusted, cloths were laid nearby, warm water was placed within reach. There was no rushing, no panic, but each movement carried purpose. The midwife knew that the most dangerous part was now at hand, and though she did not let fear show, she felt its weight in her chest. The mother, exhausted from hours of pain, often believed she had no strength left. Her face was pale, her hair tangled, her body trembling with effort. Yet in this final stage, the midwife's voice became the anchor. She leaned close, her words slow and steady, guiding each push, each breath. Now, hold, again, rest. Simple commands repeated again and again, creating a rhythm that the mother could follow even when her strength was nearly gone. The midwife's hand pressed firmly against her, steadying her, reminding her that she was not alone in this final struggle. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. The attendants no longer whispered. They waited, eyes fixed on the mother, on the midwife, on the space where life would soon emerge. The oil lamps flickered, casting long shadows against the walls, the smoke curling upward into the dim air. The smell of sweat, herbs, and oil grew heavier, clinging to every surface. The city outside carried on as usual, carts rattling, vendors calling. But inside this small room, the world had narrowed to a single moment, a single effort, a single act of bringing forth new life. The midwife crouched low, her hand steady, her eyes fixed on the work before her. She gave instructions in a calm voice, never rushed, never frantic. She encouraged when strength flagged, reminded the mother to breathe, reminded her to push, reminded her that she was nearly there. The attendants echoed her words, creating a chorus of soft encouragement, a rhythm of voices to match the rhythm of pain. And then, at last, the turning point broke open into its final act. The cries grew sharper, the effort greater, and then suddenly, a shift, a release, a moment of silence before the first small sound filled the air. The child arrived. Slick with birth, fragile, alive, the room exhaled. Relief swept through the attendants, tears filled the eyes of family members, and the heavy silence that had weighed on them for hours broke apart. For an instant, time seemed to pause. All the waiting, all the struggle, all the fear dissolved. Into the single cry of the newborn Dot, the midwife, steady even in this moment, acted with practiced care. She cleared the child's mouth, rubbed the tiny body with claws worn by the fire, wrapped it in linen. The first cry grew stronger, sharper, echoing against the plaster walls. She handed the child to the mother only after she had checked. Carefully, only after she was certain that breath had filled the small lungs, that the body was strong enough to endure. The mother, exhausted and trembling, reached weakly for the child, her face softening in relief as the tiny weight was placed against her chest. But the midwife's work was not yet done. She turned her attention back to the mother, guiding the final stages of birth, watching carefully for signs of danger. She knew that this was often the most perilous time, when bleeding or weakness could turn joy into tragedy. Her eyes, sharp even through the haze of hours, missed nothing. She soothed, she cleaned, she applied pressure where needed, her movements calm and steady, even as her mind stayed alert for every possibility. Only when she was satisfied that both mother and child were safe did she allow herself the smallest exhale of relief dot around her. The room transformed. The attendants who had sat in heavy silence now bustled with energy, preparing food, heating water, cleaning cloths. The whispers returned, but now they carried joy instead of fear. The air, once thick with waiting, seemed lighter, brighter, filled with the sound of new life. The midwife, however, remained quiet. She did not share in the chatter, nor did she draw attention to herself. Her satisfaction was not loud. It was silent, found in the steady beating of the newborn's heart, in the mother's slow return to calm, in the knowledge that her long hours of patience had guided them to this moment. The turning point was over. The child had arrived, yet, for the midwife, this was not an ending, but simply another step in the cycle she knew so well. Tomorrow or the next day, she would be called again. Another room, another mother, another long stretch of waiting, guiding, and at last, another turning point. And she would do it all again, calmly, steadily, as she always had, when the child had arrived and its cries settled into softer, uncertain breaths. The pace of the room changed once again. The hours of strain and fear gave way to a gentler rhythm, one shaped by relief and the slow work of recovery. The midwife remained at the center of this rhythm, though her movements were quieter now. Her tone softer, her presence less commanding. She no longer guided a body through waves of pain. She guided the fragile transition from danger to safety, from the rawness of labor to the calm of new beginnings. The mother lay back, her body slack with exhaustion, every muscle trembling with the memory of effort. Her face was pale. Her hair clung to her damp skin, and her breathing, though still heavy, had softened from cries into sighs. The midwife leaned close, not only to check her, but to reassure her. She touched her wrist, to feel the pulse, steadying her own hand so that even this simple gesture carried calm. She pressed her palm gently against the woman's belly, feeling for the strength of the womb contracting, for the signs that the body was closing itself after the long hours of opening. Every detail mattered, and she watched each one with careful, patient eyes. Around them, the attendants moved with new purpose. Fresh cloths were laid out, warm water fetched again, and the mess of birth, so much blood, sweat, and fluid, was quietly tended. But no one hurried. Each act was done slowly, with a kind of reverence, as though they all understood that these small labors were as important as the great labor just completed. The smell of iron from the blood lingered in the air, mixed now with the sharper scent of herbs the midwife sprinkled across cloths, both to cleanse and to comfort. The flickering of the oil lamp grew steadier as more oil was added, casting its warm light over the mother, the child, and the women gathered close. The newborn, tiny and vulnerable, lay swaddled in soft linen. Its skin, once slick and bluish, was slowly turning pink as warmth spread through its fragile body. The midwife had rubbed it gently with oil to keep the skin supple, and she had wrapped it tightly so that the small arms and legs would not flail against the sudden openness of the world. To the mother, the weight of the infant against her chest was both strange and deeply familiar, as though the long months of carrying within had simply shifted to a new kind of holding. Her hand traced the linen folds, then the curve of the baby's face again and again, as though she needed to be sure it was real. There were rituals, too, woven into this moment. In Rome, birth was never merely physical. It was bound to belief, to the invisible presence of gods and spirits who might help or harm. The midwife knew these rituals as well as she knew her. Tools. A prayer might be murmured to Juno Lucina, the goddess of childbirth, her name whispered over the child's head to bless its first breaths. A charm might be tied around the baby's wrist, a small piece of red wool or leather to ward off evil. Sometimes a touch of salt was placed on the infant's lips, a gesture meant to protect and to cleanse. These acts were simple, almost automatic, yet they gave the family comfort, anchoring them in the sense that divine eyes watched over this fragile new life. The father, who had been waiting outside or in another room, was often called in now. He entered quietly, his face uncertain, his movements hesitant, as though he were stepping into a space that belonged more to women than to him. When he looked upon the child for the first time, the midwife watched his expression closely. Pride, relief, joy, sometimes disappointment if the child was not the sex he had hoped for. All of these emotions flickered across his face. But whatever he felt, the midwife's focus remained on the mother and the child, ensuring that this moment of reunion did not distract from the fragile work of recovery. Hours stretched differently here, too. They were no longer filled with contractions and cries, but with slow, deliberate acts of care. The mother was given warm water to drink, sometimes mixed with herbs or wine to restore her strength. Her hair was combed gently, her skin wiped clean. With damp cloths, the midwife massaged her belly, watching for signs of bleeding, speaking in a voice as calm as the touch of her hands. Every so often, she checked the child again, listening to its breath, ensuring its small body stayed warm, soothing it when it fussed. The room became quieter, filled not with urgency, but with murmurs, with the slow cadence of women speaking in low voices as they tended to one another. Night and day blurred here. If the birth had taken place in daylight, the sun's angle shifted. Slowly across the walls, its glow moving from bright white to the softer amber of evening. If the birth stretched into darkness, the room lived by lamplight alone, the shadows shifting gently as oil was added to keep the flame alive. In either case, the midwife worked without thought of time. She did not leave once the child was delivered. She remained until she was certain that mother and child were both safe, that the turning point had truly passed, that the family could rest without fear. For the mother, rest was not immediate. Her body, though no longer racked with contractions, throbbed with soreness, her mind heavy with exhaustion. She held the child close, but her eyes closed often, drifting between sleep and wakefulness. The midwife allowed this, encouraged it even, but she never let her own attention waver. She knew that danger could still rise in these hours. A sudden weakening, a loss of blood, a fever taking hold. She was patient, but she was vigilant. Her calm presence filled the room, even when she spoke no words at all. And so, after the storm of labor and the turning point of birth, came this softer rhythm: recovery, rituals, rest. It was not as dramatic, not as gripping, but it was no less essential. It was the quiet stitching back together of body and spirit, the slow weaving of new life into the fabric of the household. The midwife watched it all, her hands steady, her eyes sharp, her heart calm, and only when she was certain that both mother and child had safely crossed through danger did she allow herself the smallest release of tension, the quiet exhale of someone who had carried others through yet another night of risk, once the cries of labor had faded, and the child rested quietly against its mother. A different kind of concern began to fill the household. Birth was not only about survival, though survival was always the first victory. It was also about identity. Who is this child? How would it be welcomed into the world? What invisible protections would be drawn around it to shield it from forces that humans could not see or control? In Rome, these questions shaped the fragile days that followed birth, and the midwife was often at the center of them. A newborn in ancient Rome was never assumed safe in its first hours. Death hovered closely. The smallest sign of weakness. A child that did not cry loudly, that breathed unevenly, that refused to nurse, might lead to whispers that the infant would not live long. The midwife's judgment in those moments carried enormous weight. She was expected not only to tend to the infant's body, but to assess whether this life was viable, whether it was strong enough to continue. Some midwives made these judgments. In silence, others spoke them aloud, but either way, their opinion carried the quiet authority of experience. Superstition wrapped around these early hours like a second swaddling. Romans believed that spirits, both kind and cruel, hovered near the threshold of a new life. The goddess Juno Lucina, invoked during the birth, was thought to linger. Her protection still needed as the baby took its first breaths. Charms were tied around the infant, usually red wool, chosen for its color, which was thought to repel evil. Sometimes small amulets, little figurines of phallic symbols, were hung nearby. These were not crude decorations, but serious protections, meant to turn away envy and malevolent forces. The midwife often oversaw these acts, not as priestess, but as guardian, ensuring that tradition was followed and no detail was overlooked. The naming of a child was not immediate. In fact, it was delayed deliberately. Romans did not rush to give names in the first days of life, for the simple reason that many infants did not survive. Instead, they waited until the dies lustricus, the day of purification and naming. For boys, this usually occurred on the 9th, the day after birth. For girls, the 8th. Until then, the child was cared for tenderly, but without the permanence of a name, as though the family hesitated to speak it fully into the world, until survival seemed more certain. The midwife knew this, and in her quiet way she reinforced the waiting. Her care was steady, her eyes watchful, but she never spoke of names too soon. During those first days, much of the mother's recovery depended on the midwife's attention. She prepared broths and herbal teas, mild mixtures of fennel or chamomile to ease discomfort. She rubbed the woman's abdomen with oil, firm but gentle, to help the body contract and to prevent dangerous bleeding. She arranged the bedding, changing, the soiled linens, and reminded the attendants to keep the air in the room warm and still. For the infant, she guided feeding, helping the child find its way to the breast, showing the mother how to hold it properly. These quiet lessons, given in soft tones, created a rhythm of care that carried the family through the fragile first nights. The days were filled with small rituals. Each morning, the mother was washed gently, her hair combed, her body soothed. With warm cloths, the child was checked again and again, its swaddling tightened, its breaths counted. At night, lamps were left burning, for it was believed that darkness was a time when evil spirits could creep in most easily. The flicker of flame was thought to drive them away, and the midwife would often remind the family to keep oil close. At hand, if the baby fussed or cried without reason, herbs might be burned to purify the air, or charms whispered over its tiny body to calm whatever unseen presence disturbed it. By the time the dies lustricus approached, the household shifted. From fear to preparation, the family gathered gifts, sometimes simple tokens of wool or small trinkets to present during the naming. The father, who had remained half apart from the intimate world of childbirth, now stepped forward more fully. It was his role to declare the child's name, to speak it aloud before family and friends, and in that act, to place the child firmly into society. The midwife, though no longer the central figure, remained nearby, watching carefully, ensuring the mother was well enough to stand, that the child was swaddled neatly, that the rituals unfolded without neglect. The naming itself was quiet, more intimate than grand. A gathering of family, perhaps a neighbor or two, the infant held in the father's arms or laid upon an altar as offerings were made. Small sacrifices, perhaps a cake of grain or a drop of wine, were given to the household gods. The father spoke the name clear and steady, and with that declaration, the child was recognized not only as part of the family, but as part of Rome itself. From that day, the baby was truly considered alive in the fullest sense, not just a fragile being clinging to breath, but a person with identity, lineage, and place. Afterward, relief spread through the household. The uncertainty of the first days gave way to cautious joy. Friends might visit to offer congratulations. Neighbors might bring food or gifts. The mother, though still recovering, was no longer cloistered in silence, but rejoined slowly to the rhythms of the household. The midwife, her role gradually diminishing, prepared for her departure. She gave instructions for continued care, left herbs and oils behind, and reminded the family to call her if trouble arose. But she knew, in her heart, that her part in this story was nearly finished. The first days of life in Rome were never easy, never certain, always shadowed by the possibility of loss. Yet with the midwife's guidance, with the rituals and protections woven carefully around the infant, and with the solemnity of naming, the family felt anchored. They believed that the child had passed through its most vulnerable threshold, that it now stood more securely in the world of the living. And for the midwife, this was enough. She had carried another life across the invisible boundary between the unknown and the known, between shadow and light, between silence and the first cry. When she finally stepped back into the streets of Rome, her satchel lighter now, her sandals worn from walking, the city seemed unchanged. The cart still rattled, the vendors still shouted, the fountains still splashed. But within one household, everything had shifted. A new life had been woven into its fabric, and though her part was largely invisible, the midwife had been the hand that stitched it there, in the streets. Of Rome, few people noticed the midwife as she passed. She was not a senator or a noblewoman, not someone whose name was etched into stone or recorded in speeches. She walked quietly, carrying her satchel, moving from one doorway to another, from one household to the next. Yet, behind those doors, in the hidden spaces where women labored and children entered the world, her presence was essential. She carried an authority that was both unspoken and undeniable, an authority that stretched not from law or rank, but from experience, memory, and the trust of those who depended on her hands. Roman society was not built to celebrate women. Like her, the poets sang of warriors and emperors, of generals who commanded armies, of orators who bent crowds to their will. Even when women were praised, it was often queens or noble mothers, women who shaped dynasties through marriage or birth. The midwife, by contrast, slipped between households without ceremony. And yet, when a woman screamed in labor, when a family held its breath in fear, when the line between life and death thinned to almost nothing, it was not senators or emperors who were called. It was the midwife. Her knowledge, quiet and practical, became more valuable than any scroll in a library, more immediate than any law carved into marble. Her authority began in the birthing room, where she commanded with calm firmness. Even the wealthiest matron, accustomed to servants bowing at her word, yielded to the midwife's instructions in those hours. She told the attendants when to bring more water, when to heat oil, when to clear space or fetch cloths. She told the laboring woman when to push, when to rest, when to breathe. No one questioned her voice in that moment, because to doubt her was to invite danger. Her words carried the weight of necessity, and necessity silenced even pride. But outside that space, her power was less visible. In Ramang law, midwives were not formally recognized as physicians. Their work was sometimes dismissed as mere women's knowledge, not the serious art of medicine that men claimed for themselves. Male doctors trained in Greek texts, sometimes, looked down on midwives, treating them as assistants rather than equals. Yet those same doctors rarely appeared in the crowded tenements or the dim back rooms where most women gave birth. They studied theories in marble villas, but it was the midwife who faced the reality of blood and cries, who learned through repetition, through failure and survival, through the endless practice of necessity. Her knowledge was lived, not written. This tension shaped her place in society. She was respected in the moment of need, but afterward, her name was rarely remembered. Families were grateful, yes, but their gratitude often faded into the background of daily life. The child grew, the household returned to its rhythm, and the midwife slipped back into the current of the city, carrying her tools to the next door. The next cry, the next life waiting to be ushered into the world. Her authority was temporary, renewed with each birth, but never carved into permanence. Yet, among women, her authority endured more deeply. Mothers whispered her name to daughters. Neighbors spoke of her steady hands, her patience, her herbs that soothed pain, her eyes that never flinched. Within the hidden networks of women, markets, courtyards, shared washhouses, her reputation grew quietly. A good midwife became known not through inscriptions or public honors, but through the murmur of women's voices. And in that way, she built a kind of legacy, passed not in marble, but in memory. In the trust that spread from household to household, the midwife also held authority in matters beyond birth. Women sought her advice for pregnancies, miscarriages, fevers, and the mysteries of their own bodies. She knew remedies for menstrual pains, for infertility, for the quiet illnesses that women often endured in silence. She was consulted for matters husbands did not wish to hear about, matters too private or too easily dismissed by male physicians. To the women of Rome, she was more than a midwife. She was healer, confidant, counselor, sometimes even protector. Her satchel of herbs and oils carried not just tools for birth, but remedies for the unseen burdens of everyday life. And yet, for all this quiet authority, she remained vulnerable. She had no titles to shield her, no statues to defend her reputation. If a birth went badly, if a mother died, if a child was stillborn, the whispers could turn against her. Families who once praised her could shift to suspicion, wondering if she had failed, if her herbs were wrong, if the gods had been angered. She lived in that precarious balance, where one successful delivery built trust, but one tragedy could unravel it. Still, she continued because she had no choice. Birth did not stop, and so her work never ended. The midwife's authority was quiet, almost invisible, yet it shaped the very foundation of society. Every senator, every soldier, every poet, every emperor, each had been delivered into the world by hands like hers. Without midwives, the city itself could not have continued. They were the unseen threads that bound the generations together, stitching life into the fabric of Rome. Even if no one thought to write their names dots as she walked the streets, blending into the crowd, unremarkable to passers-by. But behind closed doors, in rooms heavy with sweat and silence, she was the one voice that mattered. She was the calm in the storm, the steady hand in the darkness, the quiet authority on which the survival of Rome itself depended. The midwife's satchel, worn smooth with years of use, carried more than just objects. To those who glanced at it briefly, it might have seemed unremarkable. A pouch of leather, its seams patched, its straps creaking softly when lifted. But inside, every item told a story, not only of the countless births it had seen, but also of the midwives who had carried the same knowledge before. Each tool, each herb, each charm was part of a lineage, a thread of wisdom passed from one woman to another, never written in books, never preserved in marble inscriptions, but alive in memory, in touch, in whispered instructions carried through. The generations, the scissors, for instance, were not new. They rarely were. They were bronze, dulled by time, their edges not gleaming but serviceable. They had been used to cut umbilical cords, perhaps hundreds of them. Their surfaces scrubbed again and again with water, oil, sometimes even salt to keep them clean. A younger midwife starting out might have received them as a gift from her teacher, or inherited them from a mother or aunt who had practiced before her. And with the object came stories. This pair was used when I delivered the neighbor's twins. Or, with these, I cut the cord of a child who grew strong enough to outlive us all. In Rome, tools carried memory, and memory carried authority. The herbs in her pouch told their own tale. They were gathered carefully, some purchased in markets, others picked in the quiet edges of fields beyond the city walls. Fennel, to help the flow of milk. Poppy, to ease pain when it became unbearable. Rue, for protection, though its bitterness reminded her always of the fine line between healing and harm. Honey, thick and golden, used to dress wounds and soothe. Mouths too dry from labor. These remedies were not invented anew by each midwife. They were taught step by step, through demonstration, through observation. A midwife learned not by reading a scroll, but by watching another prepare a poultice, by smelling the strength of a root, by touching a dried leaf and learning its roughness so she could recognize it in the dark. Secrets were shared not in lecture. Halls, but in kitchens and small rooms where women gathered. An older midwife might lean close to a younger one and say, "When the child lies the wrong way, try this position first." Or, "If the bleeding does not stop, press here, not there." These were not instructions shouted over crowds, but murmured quietly, as if too precious to risk being overheard by those who might dismiss them. Male physicians might claim knowledge through the words of Galen or Hippocrates, but the midwives trusted what had been tested again and again in practice, not theory, but survival. There was also a kind of ritual in the handing down of tools. A satchel, when it grew too worn, might be passed to another, its leather softened by years of touch. A spoon used to measure herbs might carry faint stains, but still be valued. Even scraps of cloth, washed and rewoven, could become symbols of continuity. The younger midwife, holding these items for the first time, would feel the weight not only of the leather or the bronze, but of the women who had held them before, whose hands had steadied others in the same work. It was not just a tool. It was a trust. The transmission of knowledge was also guarded carefully. A midwife might share openly with a chosen apprentice, but rarely with outsiders. The fear of misuse was real. Remedies could heal, but they could also harm, and in the wrong hands. Herbs that ease labor could be twisted into poisons or used to end pregnancies secretly. For this reason, some knowledge was spoken only in part, withheld until the apprentice had proven her patience, her steadiness, her discretion. This guarded passing of secrets created an invisible lineage, stretching back through centuries of Roman women, each one shaping the knowledge slightly, adding her own experiences. Then, handing it on again, the midwife's voice itself became part of her tools. The way she spoke, calm, steady, measured, was as essential as any herb or cloth. A laboring woman listened to the midwife's words more closely than anyone else's, and apprentices learned to copy that tone, to weave reassurance into commands, to sound certain even when the outcome was uncertain. "Breathe now," said. Softly in a steady rhythm could mean more than any potion. "You are strong," repeated gently, could give a woman's strength to endure another hour. Words like herbs were measured carefully, and their effect could be just as powerful. Superstition, too, had its place among these secrets. Not all remedies were physical. Some were gestures, passed down without question. A thread tied around her wrist, a whispered prayer to Lucina, a charm placed beneath the bed. These acts carried as much importance as the herbs. Even if the midwife herself did not fully believe, she understood their power. Belief itself could steady a woman, calm her heart, ease her fear. And so the midwife carried these practices as part of her invisible satchel, handing them down along. With the scissors and oils never separating them because together they formed the web of care that women expected. Over time, a midwife became not only a keeper of tools, but a keeper of memory. She remembered births, who had labored easily, who had struggled, who had lived, and who had not. She remembered the exact mixture that had soothed one mother's pain, the position that had saved another child, the moment when silence had fallen and she had whispered words of comfort, even in failure. These memories, too, were passed down, though not always directly. Sometimes they lingered only in the way she placed her hands, or the way she adjusted a cloth. Small gestures carrying traces of those who came before. And when her own time drew near to end her work, when her hands grew stiff and her eyes less sharp, the midwife chose carefully who would inherit these tools and secrets. She did not always pick her daughter. Sometimes daughters had no interest, or no patience. Instead, she looked for a girl who watched closely, who asked questions quietly, who lingered after others left. She gave her small tasks first, folding cloths, preparing water, grinding herbs. Then, when trust deepened, she revealed more. How to the child's position through the mother's belly. How to sense when birth was near. How to listen to silence and know whether it meant rest. Or danger. In this way, Roman midwives built an invisible chain across centuries. Each link was fragile, each woman easily forgotten in the larger stories of Rome's emperors and wars. But the chain held. Tools passed from hand to hand, knowledge from voice to voice, gestures from one generation to the next. And so the satchel remained filled, not just with herbs and bronze, but with memory, with secrets, with the weight of countless lives brought into the world. The city outside rarely noticed this passing. To them, a midwife was just another woman walking the streets. But within the hidden rooms where birth unfolded, she carried the voices of those who had come before, and prepared quietly to hand them forward again. Her tools were not shiny, her knowledge not celebrated in marble, but together they shaped the rhythm of life itself, the slow, steady thread that tied the past to the present, and the present to the future. To live as a midwife in Rome was not only to know herbs and tools, but also to move in the shadow of the gods. Birth in the Roman mind was never a purely physical matter. It was a passage between the human and the divine, a threshold where life itself was ushered into the world under the gaze of powers greater than any person. And so the midwife was not merely a practitioner of medicine. She was, in her own way, a servant of the gods, a quiet mediator between women in labor and the unseen forces that ruled over beginnings and endings. There was Lucina, the goddess most often called upon in childbirth. Her name itself came from lux, light, for she was thought to bring children from the darkness of the womb into the light of the world. When a laboring woman cried out her prayers, she cried to Lucina. When the midwife placed her hands upon belly, she did so knowing that she was thought to work under Lucina's watchful presence. Often, small shrines were placed in homes, or simple offerings were left. A coin, a sprig of flowers, sometimes just a whispered word, as a way of asking for her favor. And the midwife, even if she doubted, did not dismiss it. She knew the strength belief could carry, but Lucina was not alone in this. Juno, the great goddess of women, was always present in the minds of those giving birth. Juno Lucina, in particular, was invoked for safe deliveries, and her name might be spoken over and over in the room as a woman labored. Other divine figures lingered at the edges as well. Carmentis, the goddess of prophecy and childbirth. Nona and Decima, the fates who measured life. Even obscure household spirits thought to guard against illness and danger. A Roman home was never without its Lares and Penates, the domestic spirits who watched over family life, and during a birth, these two were thought to hover close, listening. The midwife herself became part of this ritual landscape. Families expected her to know the proper prayers, or at least to tolerate them. If an amulet needed to be tied around the mother's wrist, it was the midwife who often tied the knot. If incense was to be burned, she was the one who reminded the attendants to keep the smoke steady, not stifling. Sometimes she carried her own charms, small figurines, beads carved from bone, strings of herbs meant not only for physical protection but also for spiritual. Even when her skill lay in steady hands and practical remedies, she did not separate it from these practices. To do so would have broken the fragile balance of trust between herself and the family. These rituals had a rhythm. A woman in labor might call out between cries to Lucina or Juno, and the midwife would respond with words of reassurance that blended instruction with ritual acknowledgement. Yes, Lucina hears you. Breathe now. Push with her strength. The sacred and the practical were never divided. They interwove in the room, one giving weight to the other. A cloth dipped in oil was both a tool and an offering. A gesture of encouragement was both comfort and invocation. Failure, when it came, was often explained through religion as well. If a child was stillborn, if a mother died, family searched for causes not only in the skill of the midwife, but in the will of the gods. Perhaps an offering had been forgotten. Perhaps the mother had angered a spirit. Perhaps the household had been cursed. The midwife, in these moments, bore the difficult weight of silence. She could not deny the gods, but she could not wholly accept blame either. She had to stand in the uneasy middle, offering comfort without challenging belief, speaking of mystery rather than fault. The gods have their reasons, she might say softly, and the words, though vague, carried enough weight to soothe. The midwife's own beliefs might not have been fixed. Some women were deeply devout, praying before every birth. Others treated the rituals as habit, not unlike washing hands before work. A necessary gesture, but not a source of certainty. Yet, belief or not, the midwife respected the power of ritual. She saw how prayer steadied a woman's breathing, how a charm gave a family something to cling to in the hours of uncertainty, and so she never dismissed it. She allowed the gods their place because, in truth, the work of birth was so precarious, so close to danger, that perhaps even she found comfort in the idea that divine hands might share the burden. There were times when ritual extended beyond the birth itself. A newborn child, within days, would be placed at the feet of its father, who would lift it to acknowledge it as his own. Charms were hung to protect the infant from the evil eye, from jealous spirits, from sickness that could strike without warning. The midwife, though not always present for these moments, often gave advice. What herbs to hang, what amulets to place near the cradle, what offerings to leave for Lucina. Her role did not end with the cutting of the cord. It lingered in the household as long as the family believed the gods still hovered near. Even the tools she used were sometimes caught up in ritual meaning. Scissors, once used, might be placed under the bed to ward off spirits. Herbs were burned not only for their scent, but to carry prayers upward in the smoke. Honey, given to a newborn, was more than nourishment. It was an offering of sweetness to the gods, a way of inviting favor into the child's life. In this way, every act the midwife performed could take on dual meaning. Part medicine, part devotion. The midwife lived within this blend of science and superstition, of practical skill and sacred ritual. To her, the gods were not distant figures. They were present in every birth cry, in every whispered prayer, in every sigh of relief when mother and child survived. Whether or not she believed in their direct hand, she understood their importance. For without them, the family she served would not have trusted her. And without trust, her hands could not do their work. And so she walked between worlds. 1 foot in the realm of herbs and cloth, 1 foot in the realm of gods and spirits. Her satchel carried both, the bronze scissors and the small charm, the bitter rue and the whispered prayer. This was the true weight of her work, not only to manage the fragile body, but to honor the fragile faith that surrounded it. And in this way, she held her place, quiet but essential. In the spiritual heart of Roman society, not all Roman births were the same, just as not all Roman lives were the same. A midwife's work carried her across the wide spectrum of the empire's households, from the grand, marble-floored villas of the wealthy to the cramped, smoky rooms of the poor in the crowded districts of Rome. And though the cries of labor sounded similar where they rose, the world surrounding them was shaped by wealth, by status, by the kind of life into which each child was born. In the home of the elite. The midwife's arrival was often anticipated long before the moment of birth. Wealthy families with their resources sometimes secured the services of more than one midwife, or even hired physicians to stand by, though these men rarely took center stage. The villa itself might be prepared, rooms cleared, linen brought in, freshly washed, bowls of warm water waiting, scented oils ready to ease the mother's body and sweeten the air. Slaves moved quickly, carrying instructions from the mistress of the house or the elder women who gathered nearby. The midwife, stepping into this world, entered a space not of poverty or lack, but of order and control, at least on the surface. Yet even here, in houses of wealth, labor had its uncertainty. The cushions might be finer, the cloths more plentiful, but the strain of childbirth was no lighter for the body of a noblewoman. The midwife, accustomed to these settings, learned to speak softly yet firmly, guiding a mother through the storm of labor in a way that blended practical knowledge with the rituals expected of her station. She might reassure the noble family with mentions of Lucina's favor or cite charms that were thought to bring divine protection. And she knew that in such households, every action was observed, every gesture weighed. For here, reputations were delicate, and a family's pride was easily wounded by failure. For elite women, birth was not only personal, but political. A son, born to a noble family, was an heir, a future link in a chain of alliances and property. A daughter, though perhaps less celebrated, still carried the weight of marriages to come, bonds that might strengthen the family's position. The midwife, standing at the center of this, was not ignorant of the stakes. She knew the tension. In the room was not only the laboring mother's pain, but the father's quiet pacing, the elder women's murmurs, the household's collective waiting for the news that might change its fortune. Then there were the births in the cramped, dark corners of Rome's tenements, the insulae, where families lived stacked atop one another, rooms no larger than a single chamber. Here, when a midwife was called, there was no marble, no incense, no attending slaves to fetch clean water at once. There might be only a single pot, hastily filled, and cloths torn from old garments. The air was thick, the walls closed, the neighbors always near enough to hear the sounds of labor through thin partitions. The midwife entered such places with steady composure, for she knew that here, her hands alone were the family's only safeguard. In these poor households, labor was raw, stripped of formality. There were fewer charms, fewer elaborate prayers, though belief was never absent. A scrap of cloth tied to a wrist, a whispered plea to Lucina or Juno, might be all that could be managed. The mother, often weary from work, sometimes malnourished, faced labor with a body less prepared for its strain. The midwife, seasoned by experience, recognized the signs quickly. Who would need extra help? Whose child might be born weak when danger was near? And here, unlike in the villas, there was rarely a physician at hand, rarely anyone else with knowledge. Her role became absolute. Her skill, the thin line between life and loss, the differences between these settings also shaped how midwives were remembered. In noble houses, a successful delivery might earn her gifts, coins, fine cloth, sometimes even the recommendation that secured her further work among the wealthy. In poorer districts, gratitude was expressed more simply. A loaf of bread, a place at the family's table, the promise of future trust. Yet both kinds of gratitude carried weight. In Rome, reputation was everything, and the midwife built hers not from written records, but from the voices of families who spoke of her with either relief or bitterness. Depending on how fortune and perhaps the gods had allowed her work to unfold, the midwife herself did not always belong fully to one world. Some moved fluidly between both, summoned by the wealthy when needed, but also called upon by neighbors in their crowded alleys. Others aligned themselves with a particular circle, serving mainly elite households or, conversely, remaining tied to the poorer districts where they themselves had been born. This fluidity gave midwives a rare perspective on Roman society, for they saw its extremes up close. They witnessed the anxieties of nobles who feared for heirs, and the raw struggles of commoners who feared only survival. In the span of a single week, one midwife might step into a home adorned with statues of gods and golden lamps, and then into another where shadows were lit only by a single clay oil lamp sputtering on the floor. And yet, for all these differences, birth itself reminded everyone of their sameness. Whether the mother lay on embroidered cushions or on a straw mat, whether the air was perfumed with incense or heavy with smoke from a cooking fire, the sounds were the same. The sharp cries, the sudden silence that marked a moment of uncertainty. The midwife's touch, her guidance, her steady instructions did not change. She held the same weight of responsibility in both places, her voice carrying the same tone of calm assurance. Pain did not distinguish between the rich and the poor, and neither did the fragile thread of life that stretched between mother and child. This was perhaps what gave the midwife her unique power. In a society so sharply divided by wealth, by class, by status, she moved across boundaries. She was welcomed into homes of marble and homes of mud brick, trusted in both, even if differently valued. Her work was a reminder that, in the end, all families face the same uncertainty, the same dependence on skilled hands and ancient knowledge. Birth equalized in ways that few other experiences could. When she left the home of a noble family, perhaps carrying a purse of coins or a new shawl as payment, she carried with her also the weight of whispered thanks, the relief of a father, the exhausted smile of a mother cradling her child. And when she left a cramped tenement with nothing more than a small loaf of bread pressed into her hand, she carried no less gratitude, for the bond formed in those moments was deeper than material. Reward? Both households remembered her. Both would call again. Both would speak her name, spreading her reputation through the city in the only way reputations truly spread, by word of mouth. Story by story, birth by birth, thus the midwife became a quiet thread running through the fabric of Roman society, stitching together the grand and the humble, the powerful and the powerless. She did not belong solely to one side, but existed in the spaces between, where life itself entered the world, without regard for wealth or poverty. And in this way, she carried not only her tools and her satchel, but also the memory of Rome's families in their most vulnerable moments. Memories that spanned from the shining halls of villas to the shadowed corners of the city's crowded streets. A Roman midwife lived by her reputation. It clung to her like a shadow, following her from home to home, whispered by mothers to daughters, by neighbors to friends. Unlike physicians, whose names might be recorded in texts or who found patrons. Among the elite, the midwife's worth was measured in spoken stories, in the trust she earned with her hands and her voice. In a city as vast as Rome, where thousands of families lived in close quarters. This reputation was both her greatest strength and her greatest vulnerability. When a birth went well, when the cries of a healthy child filled the room, and the mother, exhausted but alive, leaned back in relief, the midwife's name was carried outward with gratitude. A neighbor might knock at the door, asking who had guided the birth, and the name would be passed along like a recommendation far, more powerful than any inscription. Call her, they would say. She knows what to do. She has steady hands. For every success, her circle of trust widened, and more doors opened when she arrived with her satchel. But failure, inevitable as it was, could undo that trust just as quickly. A stillbirth, a mother lost in the struggle of labor, a child weakened, and unable to breathe. These tragedies did not always stem from the midwife's skill, yet they stained her reputation all the same. Families in grief searched for answers. And often the easiest answer was to blame the woman who had been present, who had touched the body, who had spoken of charms and prayers. In such moments, the midwife became both healer and suspect, praised by some and whispered against by others. Respect and suspicion existed side by side in her life, never fully separating. Many families revered their midwife as a figure of wisdom, someone who carried knowledge older than the city itself. They trusted her to cut the cord, to tie charms against the evil eye, to speak softly of the gods. Yet there were also those who looked at her with unease, for her work touched on blood, on pain, on the liminal space between life and death, spaces that always invited fear. And fear, when not understood, easily turned to suspicion. Whispers of magic often followed midwives. The line between practical remedies and sorcery was thin, and Romans were quick to blur it. A midwife who knew which herbs to grind into poultices, which oils eased pain, which charms soothed anxiety. She might be praised as skillful. But in another household, the same. Practices could be called unnatural, even dangerous. Stories circulated of midwives accused of using their knowledge not only to heal, but to harm. Of herbs given not to ease labor, but to prevent pregnancy. Of whispered words not to protect, but to curse. Whether true or not, these rumors clung. To the profession, a constant reminder that women who held knowledge outside the ordinary were both valued and feared. This tension was sharper in certain cases. For wealthier families, a midwife's mistakes could have political consequences. If a noblewoman lost her child, the household might not simply grieve. They might seek someone to blame. And the midwife, being the outsider, was vulnerable. In poorer families, the suspicion took other forms. A fear that she had brought bad luck, that she carried a curse from another house, that the gods had turned against her. In either case, suspicion could stain her name as deeply as any praise could brighten it. Yet midwives endured, for Rome could not do without them. Even those who whispered of danger knew that when the pains of labor began, when a child's cry was needed but not yet heard, it was the midwife they would call. This paradox defined her life, indispensable yet never fully secure. Every birth was not only a test of her skill, but of her reputation, for one success could outweigh many doubts, and one failure could cast long shadows. Her reputation was also shaped by how she conducted herself beyond the birth chamber. Some midwives gained respect by moving with dignity, by speaking with calm restraint, by dressing in modest, practical garments. Others were known for their warmth, their laughter, their ability to turn fear into comfort with a few gentle words. A midwife's manner was as much a part of her reputation as her knowledge. Families remembered not only what she did, but how she did it, whether presence had brought steadiness or unease. Still, even the most respected midwives lived with the quiet knowledge that their status was fragile. They were not honored with statues, nor recorded in histories, nor given the protections of wealth. Their names were passed mouth to mouth, vulnerable to being forgotten or defamed. They walked a narrow line, balancing trust with suspicion, carrying both reverence and risk in equal measure. And yet there was a strange kind of strength in this. For the midwife understood the nature of trust more deeply than most. She knew it was earned not once, but again and again, with every child born, with every cry coaxed into the world. She knew it could not be secured with wealth or position, only with presence, her hand steady, her voice calm, her willingness to stand beside a woman in her most vulnerable moment. That was her power, fragile but enduring, woven into the lives of countless families across Rome, so her reputation was not carved in stone, but in memory, in the stories whispered from mother to daughter, in the quiet gratitude that lingered after the birth was done. And though suspicion sometimes chased her, though blame sometimes fell on her unfairly, the midwife remained. For as long as Rome endured, and as long as children were born within its walls, there would be a need for her hands, her knowledge, and the fragile thread of trust she carried from one household to the next. The knowledge of a Roman midwife did not come from books. Unlike physicians, who sometimes studied in Greece, who carried scrolls of Hippocrates or Galen, the midwife's wisdom was passed through hands, through eyes, through years of quiet apprenticeship. She learned not by reading, but by watching, not by theories written in ink, but by lived experience whispered in the hushed rooms where women labored. Most midwives began as assistants, young women who carried basins of water, who fetched cloths, who listened to the midwife's instructions and slowly absorbed her rhythm. They stood in corners during long nights, observing how a laboring woman was comforted, how her body was supported, how the midwife adjusted her tone of voice from calm to commanding when the moment required, slowly, almost invisibly. The apprentice's hands learned the gestures, how to hold a mother's shoulders steady during pain, how to feel for the baby's position, how to cut a cord without hesitation. Nothing was written down, for much of it could not be. It was muscle memory passed from one generation to the next dot in Rome. There was no single path to becoming a midwife. Some were born into families where the role already existed, daughters of midwives who naturally stepped into the work as they grew older. Others began as slaves or servants, helping in households and gradually learning enough to be trusted with greater responsibility. A few gained knowledge through physicians, listening as men spoke of anatomy, though midwives knew that the theories of men did not always match the reality of birth. For the body in labor could not be captured fully in diagrams or prescriptions. It was fluid, unpredictable, alive. Only lived practice taught its truth. The skills themselves were layered, gathered piece by piece. Some were practical, how to clean and prepare tools, how to swaddle a newborn tightly, how to recognize when the mother's bleeding was too heavy to be ignored. Others were herbal, knowing which plants could soothe cramps, which teas eased anxiety, which salves closed wounds more quickly. Still others were spiritual, or at least symbolic. The charms whispered to protect a child from the evil eye. The prayers murmured in the name of Lucina or Juno. To be a midwife was to hold all of these, the practical, the herbal, the spiritual, and to know when each was needed. What made the training of a midwife so unique was its intimacy. Unlike professions where knowledge was exchanged in public, this was a craft learned in private rooms, in the dim light of oil lamps, with the sounds of pain and birth surrounding it. The apprentice did not learn by lecture, but by proximity. She was there when the mother gripped the bedframe in agony, when the baby's cry finally filled the silence, when the family wept with relief or fell quiet in grief. She learned not only the techniques, but the weight of responsibility that came with them. To carry knowledge was also to carry burden, the knowledge that each decision mattered, that each choice might tip the balance of life. Sometimes, a midwife's training included travel. Rome was vast, and its empire stretched across seas and provinces. Herbs from Egypt, techniques from Greece, superstitions from Gaul, these all trickled into the city through trade and migration. A midwife who spoke with others might learn of new remedies, of different ways of supporting a mother during labor. Slowly, across generations, these practices blended until the Roman midwife's craft became a patchwork of wisdom older than Rome itself. Yet, for all of this, the midwife's training remained largely unrecognized by the wider world. No statues were raised in their honor, no schools were founded for their work. They existed outside the formal structures of education, their knowledge, preserved not in libraries but in memory, in practice, in whispered instruction. This gave their profession a certain fragility, for if a midwife died without passing on her skills, those skills could vanish. But it also gave it resilience, for the craft was woven into daily life itself, too essential to ever be fully lost. The passing down of knowledge was also shaped by secrecy. Some midwives guarded their remedies closely, reluctant to share all they knew. For their reputation, their livelihood depended on having skills that others could not easily replace. An apprentice might learn gradually, being trusted only, after proving loyalty. Even so, knowledge never remained locked away forever. Necessity demanded it. When one midwife could not attend, another was called, and the craft circulated. always alive in the hands of those who practiced it this way. Of learning created a deep sense of continuity. A midwife in Rome, attending a birth in a villa or in a tenement, might use the same techniques her teacher had once used, and her teacher before her, stretching back generations. Though no scroll recorded their names, their knowledge lived on, carried forward by each woman who had whispered instruction to another in the quietest hours of labor. It was an inheritance not of wealth or land, but of touch, of memory, of skill. And so, when we think of a Roman midwife, we must remember that she carried not only her own experience, but the layered experiences of countless women before her. Every gesture, every remedy, every whispered prayer was a thread in a tapestry woven across centuries. She was not only herself, but also the sum of all those who had come before, the unnamed midwives who had trained her, the voices that had guided her hands, the memories of every child she had helped into the world. Her training was not merely technical. It was ancestral, a living chain that stretched back as far as anyone could remember. This was the quiet strength of her profession. She stood in each birth chamber not only as one woman, but as the bearer of an ancient knowledge, invisible, yet enduring. And though Rome itself would one day fall, the craft of the midwife whispered, remembered, practiced would outlive it, carried forward into new lands, new eras, by women who learned the same way, through presence, through patience, through the timeless act of one generation teaching the next. Every Roman midwife carried more than herbs and cloths in her satchel. She carried, too, the weight of emotions collected over years of standing at the threshold between life and death. Unlike most professions, hers was not only practical but deeply personal, tied to the most fragile and intense moments in human life. For every child born, for every mother who labored, the midwife stood close enough to hear every cry, every sigh, every silence. And with each of these, a piece of the emotional burden became hers. When a birth went well, when the child emerged into the world, pink and screaming, and the mother, trembling but alive, clutched her newborn to her chest. The joy in the room was unlike anything else. It was contagious, spilling outward like sunlight after a long night. The midwife, though weary, though damp with sweat, would feel that same relief pulse through her veins. For in that moment, her work had succeeded. The family was whole, and she had helped secure it. The mother might grasp her hand, thanking her, calling her a savior. The father might exhale invisible relief, whispering blessings under his breath. In such moments, the midwife's heart grew lighter, and she left the home with a step steadier than when she arrived. But joy was only half the story, for just as often, the midwife bore witness to grief. Labor was dangerous, and death was never far. She might see a child born silent, limp in her hands, no breath to stir its tiny chest. She might see a mother, exhausted beyond recovery, slip into stillness as her family cried out around her. In these moments, the weight pressed harder, sinking into her bones. She knew she could not always prevent such tragedies. Her skills, her herbs, her prayers could not bend fate entirely. And yet, knowing this did not ease the sting of failure. The family's grief would hang in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. And the midwife carried it with her long after she left the room. The emotional toll was amplified by repetition. A Roman midwife might attend dozens, even hundreds, of births in her lifetime. Each one etched itself into her memory. Some she remembered with warmth, the faces of mothers who laughed in relief, the sound of a baby's first cry echoing joyfully through the walls. Others haunted her, coming back in the quiet of the night when she tried to rest, the image of a still child. The sound of a family's wailing, the sight of blood that would not stop flowing. These memories did not fade easily. They clung to her mind, resurfacing when she prepared her herbs, when she washed her hands, when she walked the streets alone, and yet she could not allow her emotions to rule her in the moment. A midwife was expected to remain steady, no matter what happened. During labor, she could not panic, could not cry out, could not let her hands shake. The mother depended on her calm, the family relied on her composure. So the midwife learned to carry her emotions in silence, to place them aside while she worked, and to pick them up again later when she was alone. This discipline gave her strength, but it also left her isolated. Few truly understood what she endured. Few knew the cost of always being steady for others. While bearing the weight of grief herself, there was also the matter of guilt. Even when she had done everything possible, even when she had worked with all the skill she possessed, the midwife often asked herself if she could have done more. Could she have acted sooner? Chosen a different herb? Called for help earlier? These questions gnawed at her, especially in the aftermath of loss. And though others might blame the gods or fate, the midwife often turned the blame inward. For it was her hands that had been present, her voice that had guided the process. In this way, her work left scars invisible to others, but deeply felt within. Yet there was balance, too. For every grief, there was also joy. For every tragedy, there was also triumph. The midwife's life was a weaving of both. Light and shadow interlaced so tightly that one could not exist without the other. And over time, she grew to accept this balance as part of her calling. She learned to hold joy deeply, to let it fill her when she could, so that when sorrow came, she had some strength to meet it. Some midwives found ways to cope through ritual. After a successful birth, they might whisper a prayer of thanks, not only for the family, but for their own endurance. After a loss, they might burn herbs or wash their hands longer than necessary, as though cleansing themselves not just of blood, but of sorrow. These rituals were small, often unnoticed, but they helped her carry the emotional load, giving form to feelings that otherwise had no outlet. The families, too, played a role in shaping her emotional world. Gratitude could lift her spirits, but suspicion could wound her deeply. A kind word from a mother, a smile from a father, the laughter of children as she left the house. These moments reminded her of why she did the work. But an accusing glance, a whispered suspicion, a cold dismissal after a tragedy, these cut more sharply than any physical wound. They reminded her that her position, however vital, was always precarious, balanced between reverence and distrust. And still, despite the heaviness of it all, the midwife continued, because she knew that her work mattered in a way few other professions did. Each birth shaped a family. Each child carried the hope of its parents, the continuation of a lineage. Each successful delivery was not just the survival of one woman and one child, but the preservation of memory, of tradition, of Rome itself. The midwife bore the emotional cost because she also bore the knowledge that without her, the city's future could falter. So when we picture the Roman midwife, we must see not only the practical woman with her herbs and tools, but also the quiet figure who carried the unspoken emotions of her world. The joy of life beginning, the grief of life ending, the guilt, the pride, the sorrow, the hope, all of it living within her, shaping her into someone at once ordinary and extraordinary. For though her name may not be remembered, the emotional strength she carried sustained generations, one birth at a time. When the Roman midwife walked the streets of her city, there were no statues raised in her honor. No inscriptions carved her name into marble. No poets sang of her hands. No generals boasted of her victories. She moved in silence, often unrecognized, often unnoticed, her work carried out in private rooms and the shadowed corners of life itself. Yet her legacy, quiet, invisible, and enduring, was one of the most profound in the ancient world. The midwife's legacy was not built of stone, but of flesh and breath. Every child she brought into the world was a thread in a tapestry she would never see completed. Those children grew into citizens, farmers, soldiers, mothers, and fathers. They filled the markets, marched in the legions, tilled the fields, and carried the Roman name across provinces. Without midwives, Rome itself would have struggled to endure, for it was through them that life was sustained, one fragile delivery at a time. Her knowledge, too, left its mark, though it was never written in scrolls or celebrated in academies. The remedies she prepared, the techniques she passed on, the wisdom whispered to apprentices. All of it traveled forward in time. Some herbs she used remained in folk medicine for centuries, their effectiveness quietly confirmed by generations. Of women who repeated her methods, some rituals she performed lingered too, not because they were proven, but because they carried comfort, because they gave shape to the fears that surrounded birth. Even when empires collapsed, even when libraries burned, the knowledge of midwives survived, not in books, but in practice, carried from one woman to another like a flame shielded in cupped hands. The legacy of her emotional endurance was equally important, for in every society there are professions that stand at the fragile edges of life, professions where the work is not only technical, but deeply human. The midwife embodied this balance. She showed that skill was necessary, but so was compassion, that the hands which delivered life also carried grief. That strength was not only in the body, but in the heart, in the ability to return again and again to a task filled with both joy and sorrow. Her endurance became an unspoken model, one that others in similar roles, healers, caregivers, attendants, carried forward. Over centuries, the figure of the midwife shifted in reputation. In some eras, she was respected as essential, a guardian of birth. In others, she was maligned, accused of ignorance or even witchcraft, her craft diminished by those who did not understand it. Yet, despite these fluctuations, midwives never disappeared. Their work was too necessary, their presence too vital. Even when their names were erased, their hands remained, guiding countless lives into the world. The Roman midwife's legacy, then, is not only in what she did, but in what could not be undone. The continuation of her role through time, her quiet persistence across centuries. Think, too, of the unrecorded moments. The smile she offered a mother trembling with fear. The steady pressure of her palm on a laboring woman's back. The quiet words she whispered and the dim glow of a lamp, meant not for history but for comfort. These moments did not enter the chronicles of Rome, but they entered the memories of families, carried in stories told from mothers to daughters, from generations to generations. Even if her name was forgotten, the memory of her care remained, woven into the intimate history of households. That is a legacy not measured in monuments, but in humanity. And so, the Roman midwife, though absent from the great narratives of emperors and wars, stands as a hidden foundation of her society. Without her, the grand stories might not have existed at all, for there would have been fewer lives to carry them forward. Her legacy is not one of glory or conquest, but of continuity. She was not the builder of empires, but the sustainer of them. Every cry of a newborn, every sigh of relief from a mother, every child who grew into adulthood, all of these were her quiet victories. In this way. Her work did not end with Rome. It flowed outward, beyond the fall of the empire, into the medieval world, into the early modern era, into villages and cities where midwives continued their craft. Even today, echoes of her presence remain. Modern medicine may look very different, with sterile instruments and bright hospital lights, but the essence is the same. The guiding hands, the calm voice, the balance between fear and hope at the threshold of birth. Somewhere within that, the invisible thread of the Roman midwife still lingers, her ancient knowledge echoing faintly in the practices that followed. And so, when we close our eyes and imagine her life, we must see her not as forgotten, but as eternal. Not in the sense of fame or grandeur, but in the quiet, enduring way that her work has never ceased to matter. The legacy of the Roman midwife is not written in history books, but in life itself, in the countless generations that would not have existed without her. Her legacy is every breath that followed, every lineage that survived, every moment of humanity carried forward. She walked the streets without recognition, but she shaped the world nonetheless. And perhaps that is the truest form of legacy. Not the monuments left behind, but the lives continued. The quiet endurance of a craft that has always and will always matter.